All right. How are we doing, church? We got two doing good, everyone else doing mediocre? All right. It's all right. I'm glad you're here. Hebrews 11. So we're continuing this series called Unlikely Heroes, and what we've seen are men and women throughout history. They're unlikely because they're normal. We see them as heroes of the faith, but there is regular people who walk by faith. Giving us many examples of what it looks like to live by faith. Their faith led them to really live out of their lives flowing overflow from the Lord. As James 2 tells us, faith without works is dead. So our faith leads to works. And what we're continuing to ask is our faith, is it working? And on the flip side, maybe the negative, if our faith isn't working, typically that means if something's not working, it's broken. So is our faith being put to work? We're going to be in Hebrews 11, as Stephanie read for us this morning. If you're taking notes, you can title this sermon, Faith in the Testing. Faith in the Testing. Let me start off by asking, anybody enjoy taking exams or tests? Anybody? Not one hand, shocking. Neither do I. I'm awful at them. It's interesting. I didn't really care in school because I didn't really care about school, so tests weren't really that big of a deal. By God's grace, I passed and graduated. That's a miracle of itself, a story from another time. But when I got into my profession, as many of you know, I served 15 years in the fire service. And in the fire service, you have to take a lot of tests continually, over and over, both paper-based, computer-based tests and practical application-type tests. And man, I get so anxious. And I would learn to study and I would apply myself, but every time I sat in front of the computer ready for the test, it's like everything that I studied for and learned was washed away. I couldn't remember a thing. So anxious and nervous. And so I'm a poor, terrible test taker. It's interesting, as I think more about that, what caused my anxiety that would just wash away everything that I've learned was just being caught up on my own capabilities. Like depending on myself is really what I was dependent on. It's only me. And that caused me to be anxious. It's interesting, that same anxiety, but when we're called to depend on others, how that can make us even more anxious. Because now we can do okay depending on ourselves sometimes because we think we're pretty strong. But to depend on someone else is a whole different thing. But that's not how God tests us. That's what we're going to see this morning. God calls us not to depend on ourselves or someone else. God calls us to depend on Him. And that changes everything. And so again, if you have your Bibles, we'll be in Hebrews 11. But primarily, it's going to be a jumping off point because we'll spend the bulk of our time in Genesis chapter 22. So if you can get to both those places. Again, Hebrews 11, we see by faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. He received the promise, and yet he was offering his one and only son, the one to whom it had been said, your offspring will be traced through Isaac. That's wildly important. This is what we seen 2 weeks ago with our sermon, Faith Like Sarah. Is that this son, as God would promise in Genesis 17, would be blessing through Sarah, and she will produce nations. God says kings of peoples will come through her, specifically through Isaac. And what we saw 2 weeks ago is Isaac was born out of God's promise to Abraham and Sarah, which was a miraculous miracle because they were well beyond the age to have kids. As Genesis 11 says, basically as good as dead. And so this child, Isaac, was a miracle. It was also a testament to God's faithfulness and provision. What we're going to see is God would call Abraham here to do the unthinkable with this child who came out of the impossible. God would call Abraham to do the unthinkable with the same child that God would call and provided out of the impossible snare that they were in. Which brings us to Genesis 22. Starting in verse 1, we're going to look at 1 and 2. It says, after these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, here I am, he answered. Take your son, he said, your only son Isaac, whom you love, go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about. Let's just pause there. It's a reminder that we've seen over and over in this series that men and women of these great faith, they were known of faithful people in this Hall of Faith type chapter, Hebrews 11, because they walked with God. We keep going back to this phrase, walked with God. It means they lived daily walking with God. And so as they walked with God, of course, they're going to be hearing from God. And that's what we see here, is Abraham was hearing from God. And so it begs the question, are you hearing from God? Or is that for those super religious people? Isn't that what we think? Like we put people on these platforms like, yeah, you hear from God. I just here doing my thing and I don't have that relationship. That's not true. We're all called to be hearing from God, but I'm just wondering, are you hearing from God? And if not, why not? Are distractions in your life causing a deafness from you hearing from God? I mean, think about all the distractions that we have. I mean, the phone's an easy one. I realize that. But there's some things that we don't even realize are distractions. How about busyness? Are you busy? I know you're busy because I ask you, how you doing? Oh, busy. That's how you're doing. It's not even good, bad. I'm busy. Relationships can be distractions. How about even family members? You ever thought about that? Family can be a distraction. Are things distracting you, pulling you away from the Lord, causing a deafness to where you're not hearing from the Lord? And notice it said God tested Abraham. I think we get uncomfortable with that because I don't think we rightly understand what God's testing means and does. And a test is something you'd be tempted to resist, to be quite honest. But what I want us to see this morning is that there's blessing in the testing. You guys ever think about that? There's blessing in the testing. The psalmist in Psalm 66, verse 10 says, "For you, God, tested us. You refined us as silver is refined." I mean, you may not always like it or understand it, but there's something good that God's producing in it, like silver that's thrown into the fire to remove the impurities. It produces something that is good. God's testing has a clear aim of faith building. We need to understand that. God's testing has a clear aim of faith building. It's interesting. I was thinking about this, and why would we not want something that God intends for good, even though it seems to contradict what seems good to you? I mean, ask that again, because we got to just wrap our minds around this a little bit. Why would we not want something that God intends for good, even though it seems to contradict something that seems good to you? Let me give you just a common example. If you've been around Christian circles for any amount of time, what's one thing that people tell you not to pray for? Patience. Listen, if you need to be praying for patience, that's probably because you need some patience. But they tell you, don't pray for patience because God will give you opportunities to be patient. You know what happens if you don't pray for patience? God's going to give you opportunities to be patient. Just walk out the doors today, right? There's opportunities galore to be patient. But why would we not want God to grow patience in us if that's something God's showing that we need to grow in? It's a good thing. It's like we're so scared that God's going to give us something beyond what we can handle. Now he's going to give us some scenarios that are going to press us to press into him, and that we don't like because we like to depend on ourselves. It's interesting, as we looked here, I'm just convinced that Abraham would have all kinds of questions with this test that God was putting on him. Have you had questions for God? Yeah. And that really truly is a natural part of following him, especially if you're truly following him, because he's going to put you in positions to where you're going to have some questions. Those questions should drive you to pursue him, not push you away from him. And this test specifically with Abraham stands in clear contradiction of God's promises and provisions that he gave to Abraham and Sarah. Clear contradiction. I mean, number one, God promised and provided this son named Isaac to Sarah and Sarah. Promise number two, that this son would become a great nation and be a great blessing to all nations, Isaac. So it would make no sense to go offer his son. So what would Abraham do? he would choose to do the unbelievable. That is, choose to believe. And you got to think he didn't understand all this. You got to think he had questions. But even through the questioning, he would choose to believe. Which leads us to verse 3. It says, so Abraham got up early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took with him 2 of his young men and his son Isaac. He split the wood for a burnt offering and set out to go to the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. Then Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there to worship. Then we will come back to you. That's noteworthy. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac. In his hand, he took the fire and the knife, and the 2 of them walked on together. Pause there. This is interesting. So 3 days journey. 3 days, some estimate about 50 miles. That'd give you plenty of time to do some thinking, wouldn't it? It's interesting, considering there's about 2,000 steps in 1 mile. This is 100,000 steps that God gave Abraham to start thinking about this testing that he was going through. Could you imagine the praying that Abraham was doing? I mean, just think about, he was a human. He was a normal person like you and I. It doesn't say the experiences that he's experiencing in this 3-day, 100,000 step journey that he was on. But you got to think the emotions that were just welling up inside of him. So what kept Abraham going? What kept Abraham going and following this seemingly nonsensical calling? Faith. And based on what we've seen in the series, it was faith, but it was specifically in God's faithfulness. God is faithful. I think we need to remember that sometimes. So I think we forget. Despite if you understand it or not, what's going on around you, God remains faithful. He had to have been thinking because he saw it. God was faithful before, he'll be faithful again. God was faithful before, he'll be faithful again. God was faithful before, he'll be faithful again. 2 Timothy 2:13 says, if we are faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot deny himself. Faithful is who he is. It's not something he does. He cannot change himself. He remains forever faithful. So it begs the question, when have you seen God's faithfulness demonstrated in your own life? We would do well to regularly meditate on God's faithfulness, whether in history or in the history of our own lives. Because what that does, they're actually faith building. As you meditate on God's faithfulness, how he showed up over and over and over again, it actually builds our faith for the next faith mountain that we face. I think when each of these 100,000 steps potentially that he was taking, and he couldn't comprehend, even though he kept following, Abraham chose, as 2 Corinthians 5:7 says, to walk by faith, not by sight. Some versions say live by faith. It's just walking out, living by faith, not by sight. The sight means even when you don't understand it, you keep going. Walking by faith, not by sight. The old movie, and many of you have probably seen it. I've seen it when I was a kid. I don't remember much of it. So, Indiana Jones. I know they have like 80 of them. Indiana Jones. But there's one scene that stuck out to a kid, and I had to re-look at it this week because it was noteworthy. Indiana Jones is in this kind of cave structure, and he's standing on the edge of this cliff, and he has to cross this chasm to the other side. And he can't jump, it's too far. And there's no bridge, it's empty, and if you look down, it's just blackness, fall into blackness. But he has to get over there. And what the point is, and what he has to do, he has to take this leap of faith. There's nothing there, but he has to believe there's something there because he knows he has to get over there. And so what Indiana Jones does, the big gulp and a sigh and holds his breath, he just steps off. And in the nothingness appears a bridge. And as he takes a step, now he can see the bridge that goes all the way across the chasm. The reason this sticks out to me, because I think this is more biblical than maybe they intended, maybe they didn't. But as God called Abraham, Genesis 12, he says, go to the land that I will show you. Meaning he had to start taking steps first to know where God was leading. Even here, go to the place I will show you. This is how God operates with Moses. Go free, lead my people out, and you'll know that I'm with you, because after you lead my people out, you'll worship on this mountain. Means I'll show you later. You take steps, and I'll show you as you go. This is what faith looks like, walking by faith, not by sight. We like all the answers up front. That's not the way God operates. You know why? Because when you don't have the answers, but you know you want to follow God anyway, you have to press into God for more answers as you go. But we don't like that. It's hard, and it's scary. And if you think Abraham had some questions, we know Isaac had questions. I mean, wouldn't you? Dad, I got some questions. That's what we see in verse 7. It says, then Isaac spoke to his father Abraham and said, my father. He replied, here I am, my son. Isaac said, the fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? That's a valid question. Abraham answered, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. Then the two of them walked on together. It's a valid question. We're coming to worship, provide a burnt offering, but we're missing one key element, the offering. But notice he said, God will provide. And I believe Abraham believed that. But I believe Abraham believed two things. God will provide the lamb, but he also believed that God would resurrect Isaac. Where did I get that from? Hebrews 11, verse 19. It says that. He considered God to be able to even raise someone from the dead. Therefore, he received him back, figuratively speaking. And so I do believe that that Abraham specifically believed both, the resurrection that would lead to worship. God can do both. It is interesting that Abraham believed God would do something that his eyes had never seen before, specifically raise someone from the dead. Walking by faith, not by sight. So many times we want to experience something to believe it. That's not where God calls us so many different times. He calls us to something first, and then you can experience to build your belief, and you take the next step of faith, of faith, of faith, of faith. It's called trust. It's interesting, this receiving back, meaning that Abraham had to give Isaac to God in his first place. As I was thinking about this, my dad, when I was a kid, told me a story that wasn't influential at the time at all. I think this is significant for parents, encouraging. He told me a story that when I was a baby, he took me out into the yard and prayed over me, specifically thanking God, but also giving me back to God. It's interesting. As a kid, it didn't mean much to me. I was like, that's weird, right? Unbelieving kid. That's neat, Dad. Thanks for sharing. Gotta go play. You know what I mean? But man, it changed when I became a believer and I had my first kid. I saw the impact of what that really meant. Trusting God was his most valuable possession of sort. The thing he treasured most. His one and only son. And so I've practiced that with all of my kids. And you all know I have like 85 kids, roughly. But with each kid, and it doesn't get easier. Because what I'm saying is, come what may, I'm trusting you with this kid. As long as I have this baby that you've entrusted to me to care for, I will do my best to honor you and raise this child up to knowledge and to follow you. But come what may, I trust you. This is your child. It's a hard thing. It didn't get easier. 7 kids, to be specific. That's what trust means. So let me just ask questions of 2 groups of people we have in this room. Group number 1, those with kids. Do you trust God with your kids? It's interesting because I think we'll say yes, and we believe it. But man, if you really search your hearts, and I'm going to encourage us to do this with these questions, do we truly trust God with our kids? And number 2, do your kids see your faith lived out? Did your kids see your faith lived out, or is this something you say? Because what we say have to match what we show. And we've heard it. Actions speak louder than words. Are your kids seeing your faith lived out? Group number one. Group number two, those without kids. Are people around you seeing your faith lived out? Your family members, are they seeing your faith lived out? Your friends, do they see your faith lived out? Your frenemies, right? Do they see your faith lived out? The people where you work, the people around you where you go to school, are they seeing your faith? I've heard it asked this way. If you were on trial for being a Christian, would there be enough evidence to convict? Faith without works is dead. If your faith isn't working, dare I say it's broken. So many times you got to come back and just ask God to build our faith and maybe just to fill us afresh with the Holy Spirit. We see here in Genesis 22, verse 9, they continued on, and it says, when they arrived at the place that God had told him about, Abraham built the altar there and arranged the wood. He bound his son Isaac and placed him on the altar on the top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And I don't believe it was like that. It's probably like, Abraham, Abraham. He replied, here I am. Now think about this. Are we this in tune with God's leading? Are we this in tune with God's leading? Not only did Abraham go when God directed, but he also stopped per God's direction. Could you imagine if he's so wrapped up in the busyness of getting the thing started and to get the knife down, I was going to do it before I can't think about it, and it didn't hear God's voice through his angel saying, Abraham, Abraham. It's interesting, I was just thinking about this. Anybody remember the games Red Light, Green Light? Anybody remember that game? Red Light, Green Light, anybody? Okay, we got a couple. Who's played that game in the last 10 years? Okay, a few, more than I thought. See, I think that's what's wrong with society. We don't play games enough anymore. Adults need to play some games. You need to loosen up a little bit. But the point is, you have your eyes fixed on the person who's giving the commands. Go, stop, right? And people are falling down and go, and then stop. What if we're that fixed on Jesus as we walk throughout the day? As Hebrews 12 talks about, fix our eyes on Jesus to be able to go when he says go, stop when he says stop, and be that in lockstep as we see the military formations with the Spirit's leading. Man, how our lives would change and look different. I know I want more of that. I'm asking, do you? Do we want more of that? I'm praying we do. And notice the same response. Each time in the beginning of this chapter and here, when God speaks to Abraham, his response is, here I am. Meaning, here I am, ready to listen to do. As Isaiah would say in Isaiah chapter 6, here I am, send me. Here I am, send me. And I wonder if we're listening to be ready to do. Leads us to verse 12. The angel continued to say, then he said, do not lay a hand on the boy or do anything to him, for I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your only son from me. Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught in the thicket by its thorns. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it as a burnt offering in the place of his son. Abraham named that place, the Lord will provide. So it is said today, it will be provided on the Lord's mountain. This is a key aspect of following God, meaning faithfully following the Lord means withholding nothing from the Lord. This is what faith is. Faith actually means trust. Withholding nothing. That's exactly what he's saying. You've not even withheld your only son. Withheld nothing. It's interesting. It's one thing to trust God in the asking. When you're asking for things, God, if you just give this and I'll do this. If you give this and I'll do this, I'll do this, and I just need this and we'll do this. And it's easy to trust God. It's easier to trust God when you're asking for something from God. But it's a lot harder to trust God after the receiving. You guys ever experienced that? We were thinking about this recently. A couple of years ago, the government gave a lump of money, right? 2020, is that when it was? Based on several things in your family. And it's interesting because we practice tithing plus, right? The 10th plus generosity and giving. And so we knew whatever the government would give, we'd give a 10th, and then, this whole stimulus put the money back into the economy type of mindset. And man, when you get it, thousands of dollars, it seems different. It's interesting how greedy I can be. It was easy before I had the money. Then when you get the money, it seems like, oh, but I could just do so much with that. Like, it's a large chunk. 10%, that's a lot. It's a lot easier to trust God in the asking than it is to trust God after the receiving. That's where God presses in to test where our faith truly is. Think about this. What if Abraham would have said no? You ever thought about that? What if Abraham would have said no? He could have. He would have missed the blessing of the testing. He would have missed God's moving, experiencing God's providing. He would have missed all that. Was it hard? Yes, but was it worth it? I'm convinced he would have said a resounding yes. What if you just said no? How many times do we say no and just miss the blessing of some God's testing that he puts on our path? I don't know what you hear, and this is my fear this morning, that what you hear when you hear testing, because sometimes we hear things like sin and suffering. God doesn't do that. God doesn't do that. Now we know he allows us to do some things and things to happen around us because of the sinfulness of all of creation. He doesn't do it. So when we see him testing, his testing is producing something actually good with the aim of faith building. But we don't like the testing. Because what does it do? It calls us outside those areas that we feel comfortable in. I like my plans. I like things I know how to do. I don't like being in situations where I have to learn new things in uncomfortable situations. And we like being comfortable. We put a lot of money and energy in being comfortable. I know that. Which leads to my favorite quote of all of human history. It comes from my favorite movie, The Greatest Showman. My favorite. I don't even like musicals, but I like that one. But P.T. Barnum in that movie says, comfort, the enemy of progress. More biblical than he knew. It's exactly what stops us from following the Lord is comfort, security, safety, and that's not where God's called us. I've heard it said, I was in East Asia one time, and this group of missionaries working with this, a group of church people working with a missionary, and the church people were talking to this missionary. It's like, oh yeah, the safest place to be is inside God's will. Ask a missionary that, see what they say. It is not the safest place to be. It's quite the contrary. Now, is it the best? Absolutely. But we're not going there for safety. We're going there for obedience. And in the obedience, you experience God's goodness. And it's moving, and it's providing, and it's faith building. And the relational aspect you see is actually real, not this thing that you heard of from other people. I've said this several times, and I'll continue to say it. In one way, I wish everyone can plant a church. Now that said, I never want to do it again, just to be honest. People ask me, well, you want to do it again? No, I really don't. No. But man, what a faith-building journey it was. And is. And I wouldn't trade it. Because you have to step out in areas that you have no idea about. You only know God's going to provide. Saying plant a church, you can't create people, right? But I like the word planting because what it means is that you do the seed, right? You do the planting, but God provides the growth. You do what God's called you to do, but he provides in areas only he can provide. And so we take steps of faith, but watching God do the work. It's an amazing thing. But really, that's what God's called all of us who follow Jesus to do it on a daily basis. Just walk in obedience and watch him provide the growth. God will push us beyond our own rationale in order to build our relationship with him. Areas that we don't understand. That's why I'm convinced Proverbs 3:5 continues to remain true and one of my favorite passages. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not rely on your own understanding. Because when God pushes you outside your own understanding, it could either lead you to questioning and disobedience, or to trust in the Lord with all your heart and follow even when you don't understand. This is exactly what Abraham did. Follow when it didn't make sense. So what do we do with this? We're going through the series Unlikely Heroes because we're looking at average men and women throughout history that just walked with God by faith, living faithfully daily. So let me ask just 3 questions as we consider what God's leading us in our own lives to do with this living example. In a minute, we're just going to pray specifically through these areas. So question number 1, has God called you to something that is outside your rationale that you've said no to? In other words, has God called you outside your strength to where you've not surrendered? Just think through that. Has God called you to something that just outside your understanding that you just are refusing to do, or outside where you feel strength at that you've not surrendered to? 2 Corinthians 12, verse 9, the Apostle Paul is relaying what God spoke to him, and God says, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is perfected in weakness. Sometimes we don't see God's power because we're not able to just lean into our own weaknesses. We're afraid to go into areas where we're weak. And no wonder why we're not seeing God move or experience God's power, because we're staying in our comfort areas where we feel strongest. Because many of you, like me, I like control. And to be honest, God doesn't like me liking my control. The only right response when God calls us to do something, even when we don't understand it, or it's scary, or it's our weakness, is here I am. Here I am. So maybe that's someone in here. Maybe that's you. Just been a little too comfortable. You know God's calling you to do something more. The second question, are there areas of your life that you've deemed off limits to God? Are there areas of your life that you've deemed off limits? Like, God, you can have this and this and this, but this area over here, just don't touch that. And many people won't say, yeah, I have some areas. But I wonder if we search our hearts if God reveals something different. Let me give you 2 areas that we're tempted to be no-go zones for God in our lives. Number 1, our finances. And we know it because every time you come to church and the pastor says something about finances, you start squirming like, oh, here we go again. Pastor talking about money. I mean, think about it. Do we trust God with our finances? Or is that a no-go zone? Or maybe just we tip God sometimes. Well, here's a little bit. And take it further with your family. Do you trust God with your family? And you'll know if you don't with your finances and your family, because how stressed and angry and worried and fearful when those things are in jeopardy. Is your first temptation to go to worry or to worship when things are uncertain? That's how you start knowing, do you truly trust God with all things? And to be honest, just completely transparent, you're going to have bouts of anxiety, worry, fear. It's just, what do you do with them when those things rise up? God's always growing and working on us. That's by his grace and his goodness, because we're in a relational dynamic with a creative universe. It's an amazing thing. But just what do you do when start worry and anxiety and fear creep in because of finances, because of family? You have to run back to the Father. As Job mentions, and I mentioned earlier, God didn't do what Job experienced. Job lost a lot, if you're not familiar. He lost a lot. Family stuff, he lost a lot. And God allowed it, but God didn't do it. Yet, through all those things, in Job 121, he replies, the Lord gives, and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In other words, come what may, I trust in your name. And so are there things in our life that are off limits? I'm just asking us to consider saying, God, search my heart and reveal those things to me. And one, free me from my own control issues and help me to trust and put those things in your hands, which is so much more freeing. And finally, number 3, do you have this kind of personal relationship with God? Do you have this relational dynamic with the creator of the universe? Are you hearing from him or walking with him? Have you really put your faith, your trust in him? Is what we're asking. It's interesting. You see God's pointing to his finished work on the cross and Jesus all through this event. All through it. When he's getting ready to plunge the knife into Isaac, and he stops him. The angel points to the ram caught in the thicket. And what he does, he substitutes Isaac for the ram. Puts him in his place. And the ram is slaughtered in place of Isaac. This creates a great picture of what God would do years and years to come later in the finished work of Jesus. When John the Baptist saw Jesus in John 1, he says, look, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. Jesus says about himself, he said, for God loved the world in this way, that he gave his one and only Son so that everyone who believes in him will not perish but have eternal life. The truth is we've all sinned and fall short of the glory of God. That means God in his holiness cannot be around any hint of sinfulness, which has caused a separation because we've all sinned. You're all some good people, but you're all some sinners. That's the way it goes. But God didn't leave us in his sinfulness. Jesus stepped off his throne in heaven, lived a perfect life that we couldn't live, to die in our place, a death that we deserved, to pay the price that we couldn't pay. Substituted, took our place. And that everyone who believes that God did that for you has eternal life. And this is funny, this eternal means right now and forever. It's not just something to come. We experience God now. And so if you're not experiencing God now, maybe you really don't have the right relationship. Maybe you've never put your trust in him alone. Romans 8:31 says, if God is for us, who can be against us? He did not even spare his own Son, but gave him up for us all. And just like Indiana Jones did, it's time for you to take that leap of faith. Man, I don't understand all of it, but I know that I know because the Holy Spirit is revealing this to you in this moment that I believe. I believe that when Jesus said, it is finished, means paid in full, to tell us that he took my sins that I deserved and forgave them simply through believing in him. I trust in him. I'm turning from my old ways because I've been created new at the moment I believe. I'm asking, do you believe? If you believe, it changes everything. So start walking in belief, walking in trust. Even when you don't see it, walk by faith, not by sight, because we walk by faith in the one who is faithful. So we're just going to spend just a moment. And again, I don't know. God's moving in so many different ways because we're all experiencing so many different things, but we're asking God to speak in to areas that we need him to speak into our own hearts this morning, just to bring a reviving, refreshing that comes from his Spirit that is indwelling. So I'm just asking us just to take a minute, just in the quietness of your own heart, just be honest with the Lord. Search me, show me, and maybe for the first time, forgive me and save me. What we're going to do, Pastor Andy and I will be down front. If you would like for us just to pray with you, pray for you, we would love to do that. If you want to gather with someone right around the room that you just want to pray with, do that. But we're just going to take just a few moments, just the quietness of the room, just to pray. And here in just a moment, I'll invite our band back up and we'll continue to worship. Let's just take this moment to pause and be still before the Lord and just deal with some things that he's laying on our hearts. Again, Pastor and Annie will be up front. We'd love to pray with you and pray for you.
On behalf of the Way Church, just want to thank you for worshiping with us today. Hey, would you let us know how we can walk alongside you on your faith journey? You can do that simply by going online to our Connect card at thewaychurchrva.com. So until we gather again for worship, let's continue to be the church, one who loves God, who loves others, and makes disciples. God bless you.